One of the ways that people sometimes talk about plays is to say that plays can be mirrors or plays can be windows. We can come to a play and see ourselves reflected. We can come to a play and look through a window and see people other than us. At one level, I think it's a really interesting image. At another level, boy, I hope it's always both. Right? I hope it's always both. I hope that if we begin by seeing people where we go, oh, yeah, I have a lot in common with those people, that we start to understand how we're also different.
Mm.
That if we begin by seeing people where we go, gosh, I don't know that I can connect with these people. They seem different from me in ways that I find difficult to bridge or off-putting, that changes and we go, no, actually, we have much more that connects us
Mm.
than that separates us. And my hope is that the experience of theater connects us in both directions, connects us from audience to stage, and also connects us in the community of us in the room. And it's not about whether a play is serious or a play is funny, but that at some level things have mattered and we have all together experienced a great reckoning in a little room. That there's something there, that something enormous has happened, and yet we're going to go out and we're going to get in our cars, or we're going to walk over and get a bite to eat, or etc. And yet, if we did it right, something feels a little different. Something ticks in us a little differently. We might breathe a little differently. We might take a moment longer to hear what somebody's saying before we start to have an opinion about what they're saying. And those are some of the hopes that you have for what might happen in that space.
Hello, friends. This is To Hum is Human, the podcast where we explore the transformative power of tuning into our intuition to express our passionate purpose. I'm your host, Donnabelle, and I'm so glad you're joining us today. In this episode, Holding Space for Story, the art and craft of directing, we'll explore what it takes to bring a play from page to stage, the alchemy of collaboration, and how intuition guides the creative process. This conversation is for anyone who loves a story, whether you experience it on stage, on the page, or in your everyday life. And I'm so thrilled to introduce my next guest. Daniel Elihu Kramer is an award-winning director, writer, filmmaker, and leader in the arts. He served as producing artistic director of Chester Theater Company for 7 years, where he helped bring this small professional theater on the edge of the Berkshires to national recognition, even doubling its annual budget. His productions have received numerous awards and are often celebrated as some of the year's best. Daniel holds an MFA in directing from the Yale School of Drama, where he was the artistic director of both the Yale Cabaret and Yale Summer Cabaret. Today, he continues to shape the next generation of theater makers as the Grace Jarko Ross 1933 Professor of Humanities and Chair of the Theater Department at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Donnabelle. It's great to be here.
Well, Daniel, you've worn many creative hats: director, writer, filmmaker, educator, and artistic leader. When you reflect on your journey, what initially drew you to storytelling through theater and film?
It's a great question. I think so many of us end up in places where we aren't sure we could have predicted ourselves. We end up on these paths. One of the things I do when I teach directing is I teach an approach to analyzing story, scripts in particular, but any story from the end back to the beginning. And the reason we do that is because at the beginning of any story, including our own stories, we don't know where it's going. And it's only when we look backwards that we can see the steps that led us to wherever we currently find ourselves. So I think that this was very much in some ways an accidental place that I found myself. But if I trace back, I can see a lot of how I got here. I think that I've always loved stories. I've also always loved teaching. And I think those have been two themes throughout my career. And I grew up in an artistic household. My mother is a poet. My father was a therapist, but was also a musician. that was certainly something that was just around me. Probably the greatest disappointment I could ever have given my father would have been to go to law school. So it's probably just as well that by the time I spent my 4 days in law school, he had passed away. But I think that in the end, what drew me to this approach, what drew me to directing was that you get to do it together, right? That you get to make these communities and tell stories in community as opposed to being a novelist who goes off by herself to write a novel. That there's something about the ways that we can gather a group of people to develop how we're going to tell that story. And then we gather the next group of people with whom we want to share that story. I think that more than anything else is the draw.
Hearing now that your mother was a poet, and I'm sure your father also wrote songs, what was your first piece of writing, if you wish to share?
I have no idea, Donnabelle. I have no idea. I truly don't know. The first one I can think of was well into probably middle school or high school, and it certainly was not my first. So writing was something that I did for a while and then let go of. One of the interesting things about being a director is that you tell stories, you don't generate stories, and that those are different activities, right? And on the rare occasions that I'm actually working on a project right now, when it's my work to generate a story, I find that that comes much less naturally to me.
Well, there is something about taking words, just that is essentially the story, and then interpreting those words. And when we look at famous books of texts or history, it really is about how we perceive what we're reading. And then, of course, as a director, how do you embody those thoughts? Going back to seeing film or theater, is there one particular one that was like, wow, that was amazing when you were younger? Like, that's an interesting path. I feel like, did you grow up going to theater or seeing plays?
Did two different ways. One is that my parents divorced when I was pretty young. My mother, who didn't have a ton of money, was looking for things that she could do with me and my sister. So we lived near Princeton, New Jersey, and she would take us to college productions at Princeton. I don't have a lot of memories of those productions, but I do recall we always sat in the front row, which I thought was this amazing thing to get to do. And I later learned it's because those are cheaper tickets, but the very front row. But I didn't know that at the time. And I thought we were so fortunate that we got to do this. And I remember seeing a production of, I think, Romeo and Juliet. I could even be wrong about that. But I remember somebody walking across the front of the stage holding a candelabra with candles burning in it, which, by the way, I'm not sure anybody could get permission to do
I
anymore
was
for
just going to
safety
say,
reasons.
yeah, they don't do that anymore.
But I remember that I could actually feel the heat from those candles as they went by me, and something about this story that is at one level made up that's happening in front of me, but in another level is real and real enough in that moment that I could feel the actual heat from those candles. It still stays with me, and that was magical for me. My grandparents were big theater goers, and they took me to a lot of plays in New York when I was growing up. That certainly had a lot of impact for me. I thought of theater as something other people did for real. And even though I was involved with it a little bit in high school, much more in college, it kind of never occurred to me that it was a thing that I would do as a career, right? You might know somebody who plays ultimate frisbee, and that's unlikely to be the career path they explain to you, even if it's how they spend a great deal of their time, right? And I think theater occupied a pretty similar place for me for a while.
Well, what I'm curious about, what was the first moment you knew that directing was the path you wanted to follow?
Boy, I took a directing class as an undergraduate, directed a one-act play, a play called Hopscotch by Israel Horovitz. So that was the first play I ever directed. I then spent 2 summers in a summer theater that is long defunct, but that the college I went to and two other colleges ran together, and students ran it. And the college gave us sort of permission to use a theater and a house to live in, and et cetera. And I directed 2 plays over that summer, one each of those 2 summers, in addition to acting in some pretty badly, I think. But I had a really great time directing those plays, especially the second of those, which was a beautiful play by Lanford Wilson called The 5th of July. And I think that project was really the first time that I felt like there was something going on that felt special, that I was in the middle of an activity that felt right. I've heard in other podcasts of yours And people talk about this a lot. And it's not a way I think all the time, but this idea of flow and of being in flow, that there are moments for me in working together with actors in that room where that is a feeling that I find that I'm in. And
Mm.
there's, as you know, and as so many of the guests you talk to know, there's something incredibly special about the periods of time we find ourselves in that feeling of flow.
Well, directing often involves holding space for others' creativity while guiding a shared vision. How do you balance that structure and freedom in that process?
So it's interesting. I think when I first had ideas about what a director did, and even when I was first directing, they were pretty traditional ideas of the director has a vision and he brings that vision and makes sure everything fits it. And I say he intentionally because I think it's a very male idea about what that kind of director is. And it comes out of a tradition of the great theater directors as understood a certain way, which is a tradition of a bunch of men, many of them with beards. And there's certainly a need for a point of view. But I think that what I've found and what I've tried to change about my own work is that that's the least exciting part in some ways. Because I teach directing also at Smith, I get the opportunity to think pretty consciously about what directing consists of and what I think the central activities and skills are that a director can bring to the work. If you're teaching students, you have to be able to say, what is this thing and how do you work on it? I've come to a very different place where I think that what I'm really trying to do is to say, what's the strongest, most alive, most resonant experience that I can create from the play, that I can create from the people in the room with me, from myself, right? How do I create an experience that draws from all of those particular individuals? What's the fullest, most alive possible theater event that this group of people who are together right now can make? And that means that it's different from the fullest version that another group of people could make from that same script. There isn't some perfect version of it that we're working toward and coming as close to as we can, and maybe somebody else will come closer to it or somebody else will fall further short of it. But rather, what's that thing that we can make? And that the way that I try to do that really is through two things, through questions and through a very particular kind of attention. What I now think of directing as, and what I try to talk about with my students and help them grow in, is paying a very particular kind of attention out of the belief that that attention is generative, that that attention actually offers opportunity, that that attention can lead people to places they might not find otherwise. That's more and more what I think about directing as consistent.
It's interesting that you say attention because kind of, as I'm listening to you, it's also a certain amount of awareness. You're really understanding the essence of what bringing all of these particular group of people in front of you into a place in which you can support them in their expression. And I go back to that moment where you were just describing being in the front row of that theater and then feeling the feeling of the heat coming off the candles. It almost opens the door to that scene where that you're experiencing right there. Now, I have to say too, being in the front stage row, you get to see everything behind the scenes too, which, sometimes for me is really distracting. But as a director, you're like, oh, how do you piece those things together? And when you enter a rehearsal room, what's the first thing you listen for beyond the words of the script?
So at the beginning, a lot of it is just what's the energy people are bringing into the space. There was early on in my training, I worked with a stage manager who talked about the attitude tree. And he said, when you come into the room, we've got an attitude tree over here. Hang your attitude up on that tree and then come on in and work. Which at one level, great. But at another level, we of course bring in whatever's going on, right? We want to believe we don't, but how could we not? So first, you're just seeing how's everybody doing. You're just trying to suss that out a little bit. What's the energy in there? And what are people bringing that day? Are we ready to dive into something? Is the plan we had for the day the actual thing we should start with? Is it not? Do we need to do some kind of check-in first? That's really the first step. You've got a plan. You always show up with a plan, but if you can't adjust that plan based on what and who you find and who we each are that day that we come in, you're going to be in trouble. So you're really trying to to say we want to pick up with whatever we thought was next, but we also want to just check in if necessary, get ourselves ready for that work, be ready to dive into it. And sometimes you go, oh, we actually need to back up and be a little analytical for a little bit.
Mm.
Another time you might come in and say, hey, we were going to do this, but it feels like we should do this other thing instead, where we just jump in.
Mm.
So there's a lot of figuring out what does it feel like in there that day.
That is, again, another aspect of just sensing and being aware and bringing attention to really what's currently right in front of you. Theater is a deeply collaborative art form. How do you create the environment where the actors, the designers, and the audiences feel connected to the story and each other?
So you're really doing this in stages, right? The relationship you have with the audience is created by the relationship you had in rehearsal. And even what you're up to in rehearsal probably grows in part out of, at least the way we tend to make theater in this country, the conversations and work that the director and the designers did together prior to that, especially the set and costume designers, lighting and sound designers will come in often a little later, have more ability to respond to what's going on with the actors. A lot of it has to do with the questions you ask, right? There's a cliche that may or may not be true that a lawyer in a courtroom is only supposed to ask questions that they already know the answer to. Right? They're asking questions of witnesses where they are confident they know what the witness will say in response.
Mm-hmm.
I think the work of the director, when I'm asking questions, which is really the first step of this, is the exact opposite, right? I should only ask questions I don't know the answer to. And then I need to be prepared to consider every answer and know that the answer is going to be different from each possible collaborator. And we offer those answers not in description, not in debate. We don't sit around and try to prove who's got the best answer, but in the form they need to take, trying something in a scene, sketching a set idea, playing a sound. We really explore through, let's ask the question, and whatever anybody can offer through their work, let's learn from that. Let's see what's happening there. And that's really the beginning of how we build that. And I think that our openness to each other in the rehearsal room, and this sounds, at least for me, I think I'm a pretty rational person, pretty woo-woo, but I think that our openness in that room and our ability to bring in all of those possible answers helps us make something that will invite an audience in the same way.
Well, to that, I ask, in your experience, what distinguishes a performance that simply entertains from one that truly transforms or lingers in the heart of the audience?
You mentioned in your intro that I was producing artistic director of Chester Theater Company for a number of years. And I used to, for folks who don't know it, it's a tiny little, beautiful little professional theater right in the edge of the Berkshires in Massachusetts. And it's deeply in the middle of nowhere. I used to describe the theater as being 40 beautiful minutes from anywhere. And then I would also say, so it's important that we put on plays that give you at least 40 minutes worth of something to talk about it on your drive. If you leave the play and go, that was nice, and the rest of your drive is, what are we going to have for dinner? We didn't do enough. I think that there's a kind of openness that you can sense in a performance, that something actual needs to be happening in front of you. Look, we're pretending all kinds of things when we do theater, right? I'm pretending this is my name. I'm pretending that these words are coming out of me for the first time ever. I'm pretending I'm in this town in Russia and I can't believe I can't get back to Moscow. Whatever it is, we're doing all of this pretend. At the same time, we need to be doing some things that aren't pretending, right? And those things live most of all on the level of the emotional. That can't just be made up. And they transpire between the people on stage, so that I'm saying words to you as if they're coming up for the first time, but actually I worked really, really hard to memorize them. That's fake at some level. But two things have to be true. One, what I'm doing with my partner up there matters to me. And so I'm trying to affect them. And even more importantly, what my partner's doing matters, and I'm open to that. I'm affecting, but even more importantly, I'm affected by the person I'm up there with. And I think that in the audience, whether we know rationally how to identify it or name it, or we don't, we feel the difference. We sense the difference when something actual is going on between the people on stage
Mm.
from when it is purely rote, from when people are stepping through stuff. And I think that that becomes the difference that you're asking about, right? The difference between do I come away and go, what's for dinner? Or do I feel a little different because of the experience?
Mm.
Do I have some question I can't even quite get the words for forming because of that time that we spent in that room?
Because you are asking questions within the producing of this play, perhaps then you bring out more questions for the audience. I've attended quite a few of your productions, and it wasn't like, well, that was solved. Oh, now I know how to go about the world. No, it's like, okay, that's a perspective I didn't necessarily consider. And what if? And that I also lead my whole path with inquiry because there's always something more that you haven't really addressed. And I'm glad you brought up the Chester Theater Company because during your time leading there, you doubled its budget and expanded its reach. What did you learn about the intersection of art and leadership through that journey?
Boy, I will try to give you an answer, Donnabelle. I think that one of the exciting things about being artistic director there was that there was a next level of this same work that I've been discussing as a director that I got to do. This work of trusting collaborators, this work of asking good questions. And that part of that consisted of the opportunity to think not in terms of a single play, but to think in terms of a season. The fuller conversation that a season of plays is, that's very different. Also, the opportunity to work with the directors who I brought in to direct the other plays in a season, to meet new directors. One of the exciting things that's been true for quite a while at Chester is that we get to bring really wonderful artists there for such a little place. And that included a lot of the terrific directors that I got to bring in. And getting to have those conversations, getting to come into a rehearsal, feel how that room is different because that director is a different person. They work differently. And saying, not you need to work the way I work, but rather I'm here to see what you're up to. And again, I can ask questions. Now I get to ask the director questions too. And again, I hope generative questions. I hope offer generative attention when I'm in that space and to empower and to offer opportunities and spaces for those range of approaches, for that range of lived experiences that people bring into a room, and to tell stories that it would never be mine to tell, but that I want to share with our audience. One of the things, if you lead an organization like this, you mentioned doubled the budget, right? Well, doubling the budget of a theater like that means, among other things, getting more people to give you money,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
If we're direct about it, it is getting more people to say, I want to give money to that undertaking. That seems valuable and worthwhile to me. And to think about the ways that we needed to be a generous theater, that there needed to be a spirit of generosity, that coming there needed to feel like we were treating everybody who arrived there generously. And the ways that that then I hope, and I apparently did, inspired and engendered generosity back in the other direction. Somebody at one point said, boy, you sure raised ticket prices. And I said, we actually lowered our average ticket price, raised the highest ticket prices, but we also started offering $10 tickets to residents of that town, of the next town over, of students, of military and their families, of people on food assistance, and to just explore how we could bring more people in. And I think that for me, the things I took away from that experience are that leadership sometimes is about making decisions and choices. It certainly is. But that if you think that's all leadership is, there are limits on where you can get.
Mm.
And if instead you think leadership is also about empowering other people to make choices, creating spaces where other people can come in and do their best work and other people can lead within the context that you're creating, then I think you get a lot more done.
And I love the accessibility that you brought to the theater for people who may have never stepped in a theater their whole lives, to give them an opening to experience some wonder in a way that they probably never would have imagined. And that I feel is true leadership when you become inclusive for all. Chester Theater, which I love, is this, you were right, it's out in the middle of nowhere, but you put it on the map because the New Yorker celebrated your leadership at the Chester Theater Company. What did that recognition mean to you personally and professionally?
First, I'll just say it was very surprising. Howard Fishman, who wrote the article, had this idea, I think, and that he was going to kind of travel around the Berkshires and see theater and somehow figure out an angle and write an article about it for the New Yorker. He contacted not me, but Angela Combest, who was doing our many things, but development and marketing essentially, and said, I'd like to come through and talk to a couple of people and see a play. Sure, great. And he came when we were doing a play that I think of as a perfect kind of play for the things we're talking about. It was a play by Annie Baker, who's actually a wonderful award-winning playwright and now filmmaker who grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts, just near us, called The Aliens. And it is essentially a play about two guys in their 30s who hang out behind a coffee shop and a high school student who works at the coffee shop and then hangs out with them. And if that sounds like it's a little low on plot, understood at a certain level, that's true. Though there are levels I think it's not. It's very much a play that asks an audience to pay attention to people they might not normally pay attention to pay attention to people they might normally walk past or even avoid. But in any case, somehow at the end of all of this journeying, Howard Fishman decided that the actual story was Chester Theater Company. And it was not all of those other places. That's the part that was particularly surprising. What he recognized, I think, was the unlikeliness of the venture, right? It's not an article that exclusively says, look at this great thing that's going on. At some level, the article says, look at this somewhat unlikely thing they're trying to do, right? And that they are trying to invite so many people in, that they are in the location they are trying to do a very particular kind of theater, which is not the most obvious thing to be doing there. And it was, first off, practically speaking, valuable to us as a theater company to be able to say, here, would you like to read this New Yorker article about what we do here? Was invaluable, of course. For me, it was a lovely opportunity to see that the work that I was doing and that we were doing was visible. I think so often we do work and we wonder what difference it makes. We wonder who notices. And to see that it was visible, that somebody could arrive there and go, what's this? This is unexpected. What are they up to here? Was really satisfying.
I imagine that because you put so much intention behind the choice of plays that you produce there and the actors you choose to work with and the way in which you're directing, when you're setting forth this experience, no matter where you are, it's like whoever happens to be there at that time can feel that, can recognize that. What a beautiful alignment of planets that came during that visit by him to be able to write something like that in the New Yorker. So kudos to you. Now, you're currently at Smith College, and I'm curious about how do you see your role as a mentor and an educator shaping the next generation of storytellers?
It's been really interesting throughout my career. I've done a lot of going back and forth or doing a bit of both at the same time between working professionally as a director and teaching. For a period of time that I was both at Chester and teaching at Smith, though not chairing that whole time, I was really working to balance the two, but that the work at Chester also has informed what I do as a teacher a great deal. Part of what I'm trying to do as a teacher is to help students figure out, how do they find what matters to them? How do they find the stories they want to tell? How do they find the ways that they want to tell those stories? A cis male teacher at a school that is officially a college for women and also has trans students and non-binary students. And it's very easy, if I'm not careful, to slip into a place where it feels, whether or not it's what I intend, like I'm there to tell people how things are done. What does a teacher do? You're supposed to tell people things, tell them facts, tell them how to do things. And I certainly have done a lot of things and have a lot more experience and training at many of the things I'm teaching than my students do. At the same time, I'm trying to offer them the opportunity to find their pathway through stuff. In the same way that I was talking about coming into different rehearsals when I was artistic director at Chester, to work with students to say, what do you want that room where you're the director to feel like? What are the stories that matter to you? How do I expose you to a bunch of different kinds of plays so you even know what kinds of stories are out there? Right? The very fact of coming up with a reading list for a syllabus. What are the plays we're going to read? So many choices have been made once you've done that, and so many claims about what kinds of plays have value, whose stories have value, who gets to tell those stories, what are the forms those stories can take, and really working to give students exposure to a range of plays and a range of ways of working so that they can start to figure out where they can find themselves in that.
Speaking of stories, we live in a world that feels increasingly divided. What role do you think theater and live performance play in healing, connecting, and fostering a dialogue in our communities?
My hope is, and I have no ability to prove this, that when we share the space of a theater, when we come together as an audience to see a story, that shared experience is truly connective. It's not permanent. It doesn't answer all the questions about things we may disagree with, but that at the same time, it reminds us of what we have in common and reminds us not intellectually, but viscerally. And that one of the things we have in common in that moment that the lights come up is that we were all there for that experience together. One of the ways that people sometimes talk about plays is to say that plays can be mirrors or plays can be windows. We can come to a play and see ourselves reflected. We can come to a play and look through a window and see people other than us. At one level, I think it's a really interesting image. At another level, boy, I hope it's always both. Right? I hope it's always both. I hope that if we begin by seeing people where we go, oh, yeah, I have a lot in common with those people, that we start to understand how we're also different. That if we begin by seeing people where we go, gosh, I don't know that I can connect with these people. They seem different from me in ways that I find difficult to bridge or off-putting, that changes. And we go, no, actually, we have much more that connects us than that separates us. And my hope is that the experience of theater connects us in both directions, right? Connects us from audience to stage and also connects us in the community of us in the room. There's a book on theater. Okay, here's an admission. I'm going to tell you the title of a book on theater that I have never really read. I have read little bits of it,
Do tell.
but I love the title of it so deeply. And the book is called Great Reckonings in Little Rooms.
I do like that too.
And that's the hope, right? And it's not about whether a play is serious or a play is funny, but that at some level things have mattered and we have all together experienced a great reckoning in a little room. And Chester Theater Company certainly is a little room. It's about 120 people. There's something there that something enormous has happened, and yet we're going to go out and we're going to get in our cars or we're going to walk over and get a bite to eat or etc. And yet, if we did it right, something feels a little different. Something ticks in us a little differently. We might breathe a little differently. We might take a moment longer to hear what somebody's saying before we start to have an opinion about what they're saying. And those are some of the hopes that you have for what might happen in that space.
Plays that I did experience at the Chester Theater, what I loved is that you brought up the difficult situations that people fidget in their chairs. They're like, I don't know if I'm going to really like what's going to happen here. In the storytelling, in the way that the actors come through, is that you really do bring about that shared humanity because of the external, whatever roles and stories we put out there may seem different than ours. When you see deep underneath, it is that commonality that brings us closer together. And that's one thing I definitely felt leaving after driving home for 40 minutes um, to think about. But speaking of reckoning, can you share a particular moment? I'm sure you've had several moments where you witnessed an audience transformed by the story on the stage.
So I'll actually talk a little bit about the aliens because which is the Annie Baker play I was referencing earlier, which there's a photo of the actors in it in the New York article, etc. One of the things I discovered was that the audience needed just the tiniest bit of help having the experience. So once we had gone through the rehearsal period, we had our first preview, which means it was a paid performance. Essentially, all it means is we haven't let the press in yet, right? We're working, we're still futzing with a little bit, we're still figuring some things out, but we need an audience to figure them out now. We can't get any further without them. We're ready for an audience, but it doesn't mean we're done working. And we did our first preview of it, and I was out in the audience, which is where you are as a director during that preview period. And I could feel the resistance, right? Not 100%, not across the room, but significantly, I could feel the resistance, this sort of, why am I here watching these guys? I don't know. There's no sort of burning plot question. I'm not wondering who did it, right? To hold me, because sometimes plot is great that way. Plot can grab hold of us and bring our attention. Some people liked it fine, some people didn't, but I could tell that we had not succeeded yet at getting the audience to open up to these characters and to the different pace and that particular kind of attention that the play was asking of the audience, or that the play wants to ask of the audience. And I realized we had to do a couple of things. And because I was artistic director, I had this cheat available to me for one of the two things. One was our own, right? One was that our tempos had to change a little at the beginning, and we had to find ways to invite in a little bit more, that we had to offer just a couple of more breadcrumbs for the audience to find their way through the woods to us early on. The other thing, though, was that I actually, and because at Chester I always came up in front of the audience beforehand and welcomed them, that I actually started saying to the audience a sentence or two about the play that we're about to watch in this case. And I said something probably not unrelated to what I said to you before, but essentially that this is a play about people we might not normally offer our attention to. And that if the audience would grant them that attention and just open that possibility up, I thought there would be enormous rewards for it. And something between the changes we made in our own tempo and rhythms early on and my asking the audience to do that opening at the beginning began pretty quickly to change those experiences. And you could see at the end of the play that literally people were breathing differently, and they were taking longer, slower breaths, and they were looking at each other, and that there was this tendency to look at the people you had come with and maybe the people on the other side of you whom you had not arrived with, and say, just not out loud, but you could sort of see people exchanging like, we're here together. You were here for this too, weren't you? That was an experience that we just had. And I would love to make a claim that those people therefore went out into the world and were wonderful people and voted just the way I would like them to vote and worked on behalf of all the causes that matter to me and were kinder to their parents and their children and their partners. And I suspect very little, if any, of that is true. But I think those moments of reminding ourselves, here I am on a podcast called To Hum is Human, and to remind ourselves, and sometimes breathing is the thing that reminds us most, and sharing breath is the thing that reminds us most. There is value in that, and that the value is, of course, in the moment, but I hope in also helping us open up those possibilities, helping us exercise, I want to say those muscles, but that's not what I mean, because somehow the image of muscles is about pushing through, and this is the opposite, right? But that there is something cumulatively transformative, I can hope, about having those kinds of experiences and the fact that they are shared experiences.
I love that. Yes. I feel like in that moment, I was suspended as you were describing it. It was almost like I could feel that moment where everything just stood still, but everyone was able to see each other in this beautiful way, quite differently. That one moment will definitely resonate, I feel, across areas. Maybe not in real, huge, discernible ways, but I feel like the ripple has started from that moment. Now, looking back on your career, Daniel, so far, what has surprised you most about the evolution of your work and yourself as an artist?
Well, first of all, thank you for the so far. I-
This is just the beginning. This is the next chapter.
Very kind of you. I think that things I know about myself, when I'm not being careful about it, I can be a pretty critical person as a kind of first impulse. I can be pretty quick to judge that's good, that's bad, that's right, that's wrong, that'll work, that won't work. Early on, I thought of that as maybe not the critical part, but parts of that as strengths I brought to directing. And some of those things are strengths I bring to things like budgeting, right? Sometimes it's really useful to be like, well, that won't work.
Literally.
But I think that in some ways I've learned the ways that I needed to be more open. And I'm still learning. I shouldn't say this in the past tense, right? It's not a completed task. The work is continually reminding me and giving me opportunities to find how to be more open, how to be more generous as a director, as a teacher, as a colleague. I would hope as a partner and parent, but I suspect that those are the places that I still sometimes do the least good translation of that. And I think that the change, not just of what do I think is the nature of the work, but what are the attributes that I bring to it that can be most effective? What are my own greatest strengths in it have changed? And I think that's something I certainly wouldn't have predicted at the outset.
Well, Daniel Elihu Kramer, your journey just shows us how storytelling can bridge people, ideas, and truths. And I so appreciate you sharing your insight and your experiences with us today.
Donnabelle, thank you. It's been a treat to have the conversation, and I really appreciate the invitation to it.
Thanks for being here. I hope something from today's conversation stayed with you or gave you a new way to look at things. That awareness, that pause, that's where things start to shift. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who might need it. You can learn more about my work and what's coming up at sonorous.light.com, and you can follow me on Instagram at @tohumIsHuman. Until next time, keep humming.